So thank you everyone for joining today's Retrofit Talks. We'll be hearing about the Clerkenwell Office project with Matt McKenna presenting on behalf of the practice Architecture for London. So I'll introduce Matt shortly, but just to set the scene, today's webinar is part of our Retrofit 24 series at the Building Centre, looking at the reuse agenda for commercial, cultural and civic buildings. And we've got some fantastic case studies in the exhibition here in our central London venue. And we've had a series of panel discussions happening in the building and then webinars like these, as well as some building tours. So if you're interested in signing up for further events, please do visit the Building Centre's website. So that's buildingcentre.co.uk. So for today's webinar, we'll be hearing from Matt shortly. He will talk you through the project and the decisions that the practice made with regards to sustainability and retrofit and decisions around materials to produce a project that's almost finished. So we'll be talking you through those various stages. It is also a case study in the exhibition, so if you wanted to come and read more and see the models, do feel free to pop in. That's around and available until the end of August. So Matt, he's an associate at Architecture for London. He's got specialism and skills around listed buildings and heritage projects. So obviously working on something like the Clerkenwell Office, which was a Victorian project to start with, will be amazing just to hear about how that's come together and how that's working for a contemporary office space now. We had Ben Ridley from Architecture for London present last year in Retrofit 23, and lots of you were very interested in putting questions to him. So I'm sure it'll be the same today for Matt. So yeah, I'll welcome Matt now to give his presentation, and thanks again for attending today.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Matt McKenna from Architecture for London. For those of you who don't know us, we started as an architect's practice about more than a decade ago now. And now we've grown actually to provide a range of services. So this includes project management, construction on site. So we have a build team. We've got QSs in-house. So yeah, we sort of provide a whole route through the project now. We found this kind of is great for keeping a focus on quality, which you sort of get from more traditional procurement. It works really well for domestic scale projects. And it also gives a holistic approach that puts particular emphasis on the sustainability. So we can kind of keep a close eye on those construction details often get missed by a lot of contractors. So yeah, so we're now about a team of 20. We work a lot on heritage buildings, often residential, but today we're going to be looking at the Clerkenwell Office project that we did. So just a very brief bit of background on the Clerkenwell Office retrofit project. This was a building we actually used to occupy before we moved out and before it was renovated. So in some ways that was really interesting because it gave us a lot of insight into how this building performed day to day. So we sort of lived and breathed this building for I think 6-7 years maybe in total. So everything from windows not working properly. I mean, I shouldn't badmouth the landlord too much, but obviously it was up for renewal. So certainly towards the end, there was very little maintenance being done on it, and it gave a really interesting insight into the building. So for those of you who know the area, it's just north of Farringdon Station, so you can sort of see the railway line coming through in Farringdon Station down here. So this is the Clerkenwell Green Conservation Area. It's just off Clerkenwell Road where it crosses St John Street. So it's this middle building in a triangular block, double fronted. So the Clerkenwell Road is a newer road, and Albemarle Way is an older road. So from the front, it's a sort of fairly typical 5 stories over basement Victorian warehouse building. You can sort of see in section, the front is fairly standard. It's sort of traditional form. And then on the back, it sort of steps back. So originally from the front, this looks like quite an altered building, but actually as we sort of dug into the background of the building, there's a lot of changes that have happened over the years. And you sort of end up with this gap in the building form. So you can sort of see it at the back and on the front. If you're keen-eyed, you can just about make out sort of 4 bays on that building. So the 2 right bays are actually a different building, and we're the middle building. And the building to the right is a sort of copy of our building that was rebuilt later. So originally we think the whole building sort of matched around that corner, and then it was sort of rebuilt. So yeah, here you can sort of see the old roofline form as we started to strip the building out and how that gap exists. So there's another building adjacent, had an extension about 2015 it would have been. Sort of an extra floor put on in the back and filled. So in some ways it's a sort of repeat of that development strategy. So this is sort of just very quickly to touch on the background. So this is in 1720 before the building was built. And then here you can see this is 1887, so it's actually the year before the building was built. It's actually not, this is a fire plan that's not shown on. And then by 1896, you can see it's been added. So effectively there's a whole host of buildings that's been formed along Clerkenwell Road when they cut through Clerkenwell Road through the medieval grid. Our building being one of them, but there's a sort of host of buildings that all match in style that were built presumably concurrently as they sort of put the city back together. So again, if you know the area, this is from the 70s, and this actual view hasn't really changed since then. So it's sort of quite a preserved area. And yeah, so this isn't our building, but you can see here, this is almost the same facade treatment, a different form to just fill in the gaps really. And then another one just around the corner. So it's just a repeating pattern of these warehouse buildings in a similar style. So stripping it out, there was a lot of adjustments that happened over the years. So the building burnt down, I think 2 years after it was built, and then it was rebuilt. So the basement we think is original, the facades a sort of repeat build. And then it got blitz damage, and then there was fire damage, and you can still see that on the facade and some of the joists when we started to strip it out. So there's a lot of layers of repair, bodging, infill, cutting it up. So early on we just stripped the whole building out, actually before the main contract was let, just to see what was there, if there's any surprises we should be aware of. We didn't find too much. It was sort of, there's little strange remnants like bits of steel that have been thrown in floors, probably to stiffen up old joists, but the main structure was still there. You know, the nice proportions that people have sought after in these buildings, high ceilings, big windows, open floor plans, all sort of remained relatively intact. And I think what's really nice about these buildings is they're quite simple to understand. So, you know, big fat walls made of bricks, cast iron columns, and then timber structures that sort of sit on those columns that give us those clear open floor plates. So it'd be really nice to have just sort of stripped it all back and exposed it all, but it was quite sort of missing in places. And obviously adding 50% onto this building, a lot of it wasn't even there. And then with the changes proposed, we were going to end up losing even more of it. So a sort of retention of that fabric and just beautifully exposing it wasn't really going to work just on its own. And then also, because it's quite a small building and extending upwards, we're actually sort of at 22 meters by the time you get to the roof terrace. Puts us into all the higher fire regulation requirements, which isn't normally too problematic, apart from the building's very small, so it only had a single staircase. So you don't normally build buildings of that height with a single staircase. So this is sort of a section through it, showing the new stairs weaving its way through the building. So we did change the stairs, and we sort of rationalized it and worked a lot on the floor plans. So this is a typical floor plan. You can see it's a very, well, by modern standards, it's a very poor lettable area to gross floor area. I mean, the core is like a sixth of the building. You'd want it much less than that, really. But yeah, we sort of went through lots of studies rationalizing this, considering the existing structure. What could we keep? How do we minimize sort of just facade retention? We really didn't want to do a facade retention. We got to this layout. It looks slightly perverse that we added a light well through the middle of the staircase, the void, but actually in the process of weaving the stairs up, you end up with a really small landing. So you can kind of, as a whole, it actually makes the course the smallest we could get it. And actually creates quite a dramatic space then that you've got this 20-meter high void through the stairs. But yeah, so this is sort of a typical floor plan of an office floor plate, but you can just see how constrained we are really. And what's shown in red here is effectively new construction that got weaved in. It's the main core through the building. Yeah, so just quickly running through the building. So this is the ground floor, street level entrance, offices come off the staircase, inserted the new lift core, and then it's retail space. Basement is more retail and communal facilities, and then going up the floor plan that we just looked at. So that just continues up first, second, third, fourth, fifth. So the fifth roof setback slightly to the new floor. So yeah, I guess structurally there's three main moves that we did here. So the first was adding the new lift core. And in the process of that, it was, foundations going in. We sort of located that and tried to work in a way to minimize impact in the existing structure. The existing entrance to the building was about 1 meter higher than street level, so we were lowering the entrance level to bring the lift in. And then all the construction on the back was lightweight. And these sort of three things combined, or certainly the building the new core and then the lightweight frame, we then deliberately loaded a lot of the structure, or as much as we could, onto that new core, which meant we minimized loading the existing building. So we actually didn't have to underpin the existing building at all. So kind of minimized the groundworks. We did have to put new foundations in to take the core, obviously, but it meant we weren't sort of digging under this existing building, despite on the back, adding 4 floors on top of the existing structure. So we just, because of site constraints and it's such a small area, quite quickly it was decided that the lift core should go up as block work. So we sort of, looking back at what people like about these buildings, the sort of exposed materials, the rawness, the robustness, sort of understanding how these buildings are built, we said, well, if we're going to build it in block work, why don't we just leave it exposed, celebrate it? It does everything we need it to do. It's fireproof, it's structurally good, it's robust, it can take a bash. Even in 100 years' time, if it's been damaged, you could just repair it, paint it, do what you want to it. But we sort of felt like just using off-the-shelf concrete blocks wasn't sort of celebratory enough of that sort of approach. So we started looking at sort of more refined architectural block. So these are by Fortecrete. So these are just some of the options we looked at. So sort of polished finishes that almost look like terrazzo, down to fair-faced block work. There's a bit more forgiving. Obviously, there's a cost and a complexity in using different blocks, but yeah, this is sort of initial explorations. And then we looked at precedents from domestic projects from other architects, which they seem to get used quite a lot in, and probably not so much on a commercial scale, but yeah, we just sort of found them quite interesting, and sort of the patterns that people started to play with. I think at this scale, it's mostly decorative. But as we were building a blockwork core already, we sort of felt like it combined two things in one. It sort of, the aesthetic and structure sort of became just one thing. So yeah, I mean, conventionally it's quite simple to build a lift core in blockwork. You can use large blocks. The problem is they're heavy. So the sort of default position often seems to be that you use thinner blocks and lay them down. We were looking at the structural capacity of the engineers, and we sort of said, well, can't we use these lightweight blocks that are sort of voided and they use about 1/3 less concrete? The answer was yes, but you can't lay them down because they don't work structurally that way. So the typical way of using those would be to stand them up, build 2 walls side by side, and then tie them together with lots of stainless steel wire, basically. And we sort of, at the time, we felt like that seemed a bit perverse, that we were taking out concrete but adding in loads of steel mesh to make it work. So we sort of had a rethink, I guess. I think my slide's stuck unless people can see. Oh. Yeah, so we sort of looked back at history and how did they originally build these fat walls? And in some ways it's quite simple. They just use headers and stretchers. So they just turn some of the bricks sideways, which ties the 2 leaves together and then create these interesting forms. So we sort of said, well, why don't we just do the same with blockwork, really? So we could use all the benefits of the lightweight blocks, use less concrete, but not have to have all the extra mesh added. So again, with a bit of development with the engineers, and so engineers Formesti, I think Nick might be listening, and Fortecrete, who's the supplier, we sort of came up with this strategy of building the blockwork using lightweight blocks, but header blocks effectively. So yeah, you can sort of see the setting out. It's sort of double header. And it's, in some ways, it's similar to Flemish bond, I suppose, almost scaled up, but slightly different in proportion and form. But yeah, so you can sort of see a traditional Flemish bond brickwork, which is how a lot of London is built. And then the sort of concrete bond that we devised. Yeah, and then then you start drawing it and you sort of regret your decision. So we sort of said, well, if we're also doing this, as soon as you start cutting those lightweight blocks down, you sort of end up with problems as well. So you try to use them whole. And So there's a lot of work done on how do we use them without cutting them? How do we set them out to make everything structurally work right? Minimizing cutting on sites is also good for dust, but also wastage. So the whole thing was sort of heavily refined to sort of really get the most out of it, minimize waste and minimize concrete use in those blockwork walls. So this is basically each elevation of the lift core and stair core. And you'll see this kind of details that change depending on the wall thicknesses, and the colors sort of identify each different block that was used. Each course basically had its own drawing. Well, not every course, but each different type of course had its own drawing. Again, identifying that arrangement and how it worked. Really trying to sparingly cut blocks as much as we could. Then the next problem was pad stones. So the concrete blocks are actually really good structurally. So if you use the solid blocks that match visually, you can actually use them as pad stones, but you then have the game of, now let's line them up. On a new build, that would probably be not such a problem, but on existing building where we had existing beams, there was a lot of sort of fiddling, trying to work out how to make them work, tweaking them as we went along. So again, each pad stone is sort of detailed and how it worked with the coursing. So you can sort of see here as it starts to work its way up. So although the typical pattern is that double header, when you get to corners, sort of little interesting things happen, sort of how they turn corners. And again, over lift heads and things, are sort of slightly different details. And again, a lot of work going into how it works with movement joints, control joints, things like making sure you don't have sort of 4 or 5 vertical lines in a row that would be a weak point. So then this is, I think this is the 3rd or 4th floor as it starts to come up. So again, just leaving this all exposed. And again, you can see here the pad stone that's gone in on the left that picks up the existing beam. So that one we sort of got lucky with, it lined up. We did, again, there was lots of kind of fine tweaks that went on to make this work. So we found, I think we worked out that if we did the joints about 9mm instead of 10, and then set all the coursing heights to that, it brought a lot of things in line. It meant all the finished floor levels lined up with the block work. It meant half the existing steels lined up with the pad stone. So it kind of sort of magic number that seemed to tidy everything up. So this is, again, as it's progressing, so ceilings have gone in. So because of the height of it, single staircase, single lift, it doesn't really sort of comply with building regulation code compliance. So it's a fire engineered solution. So really you'd want two stairs at least, probably 2 lifts as well. Obviously, if you put that in this building, you'd have almost no office left. So again, it was a fire engineered solution. So we had to upgrade the fire resistance and all the floor plates. That meant effectively we couldn't leave them exposed. Generally, intrustant paint on existing timbers is sort of constrained at 60 minutes, but we needed 90 minutes and an hour for the structure. So so the ceilings had to be protected. But the idea was almost bouncing off this idea that leaving existing structure exposed on the walls and sort of how it would relate back to the brickwork would be quite nice. I think one thing that was a real challenge was getting the staircase into that core as well. So I haven't quite worked out what we'd do different yet, but there's a bit of bashing of the walls as they went up, which has been a bit of a headache to remedy now. The light stuff's quite easy, it just rubs out, but where it's being gouged a bit heavier, it's kind of a bigger question mark. The M-Tech, the guys doing the stairs, generally they did a great job. I think it's quite a challenging install to get that into a sort of pre-finished lift core. And so you can see on the right here that we sort of did some testing where they've sort of honed or polished the block back to try and clean it up, and it's changing the texture of the bricks, the block slightly, but it's given a good result. So then the outside on completion, so the fit out's still ongoing. You can see there the new topmost extension that's gone on. That was, from a planning point of view, that was the most contentious bit from the council. They were sort of worried about how the flank elevation would look from down the street. And then, yeah, so I think, we've done a kind of all the typical sustainability, the sort of what you'd expect on a refit of this scale. All the windows have gone in as triple glazed. They're simulation sashes, so they're not actual sash windows. They're tilt and turn, but they give out externally, they give that sort of historic appearance that was imposed on us by the planners. MVHR is proposed for out. It's now going to be gas free, so we've stripped the gas out. Air tightness is going in, so we're sealing up all the gaps. Yeah, so it's basically, it's quite a high, sort of 50% beyond, or less rather, than the building code requirements for energy use. So we're getting a high B on the EPC forecast, which again was quite tricky in a small building because it's quite an inefficient volume to facade form. Yeah, so that's the rear. So you can see there, sort of the existing building only went up to the head of the first floor window, so everything above was built new. And then, yeah, just to give an idea of sort of what it should look like once it's finished. So this is the entrance lobby, the staircase going up, and then a sort of typical office fit out. And that's it, unless anyone's got any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Matt. That was great. Obviously, I've seen bits of the project before in terms of earlier images that you were submitting for the exhibition, but just to get the full story together, and hear more about all those intricacies and the decision making that went through. So it was fantastic.
Yeah, it's hard to summarize about 7 years in 20 minutes.
7 years, wow. You must have had a lot of block work dreams in that time then, Matt. I mean, so just a reminder to everyone who's on the webinar, you can put your questions to Matt through our Q&A box. So that's like a little chat function. So please do just type your questions in there and I'll address those to Matt. I see we've got one started to come through. But just to kind of kick off, Matt, at the beginning you introduced Architecture for London and said typically you'd work on a lot of resi projects. Like, how is that now informing having kind of a commercial project and potentially some more commercial projects? How's that like working? How do they cross over or inform each other? Is there much going on?
So I think it does give us quite a focus on detail, because often when you work on smaller residential projects, you understand the whole project, because normally it's just one person looking at the project. And it is sometimes quite difficult when you then scale it up to how do you still apply that. I think this was quite interesting because it's sort of, although it's much bigger than a house, it's not significantly bigger than some houses. I mean, it's 1,000 square meters on completion, which it's that sort of 6-7 townhouses, or 3 large detached houses maybe, but
Yeah.
It's almost at a scale where just 1 or 2 people can still really understand that detail and really sort of know the building inside out. So I mean, on this project it was mostly just me with one colleague supporting.
Okay.
So I think that kind of attention to detail was really interesting. I think a lot of it's probably more that the type of building rather than and by that I mean it's a historic Victorian warehouse, has a lot of relatability to working with Victorian townhouses. I mean, they're not built that dissimilar. They're timber joisted floors on brickwork walls, and all the questions of air tightness and insulation on existing masonry, and how you avoid condensation with masonry, all those things kind of cross over and relate. So I think it's not a 10,000 square meter concrete 60s building. It's in some ways it's very similar to sort of bread and butter of London housing stock.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Matt, it was great to hear. And we've got some questions in the chat now. So yeah, someone saying it was a nice project. So that's always a good comment to start with, isn't it? But question from Matt, from Patrick. Can you say a little bit more about the thermal lining of the external walls? Obviously, it's not got external wall insulation. This is Patrick, not saying that, that was me saying that. But yeah, say more about that decision making.
Yeah, so there will be. So the front facade, the whole front facade is going to be insulated with wood fiber. So obviously the external is heritage sensitive, so it's not a listed building, but it is in a conservation area. The building to the left is locally listed. So the front, and I mean the front facade's quite good quality, so I think you wouldn't want to externally insulate that. So the plan is to internally insulate and give that continuity of the thermal envelope. Obviously, the whole roof is new, and then the back doing the same strategy. So the lower floors are wood fibre, and then the new upper floors are all it's all Class A fire ratings, but it's because it's a cavity wall construction on the upper floors. That's all mineral wool.
Right.
So that's built more like a kind of new build element.
Yeah. So plenty of insulation going in. Yeah. And
Yeah.
as you said, all those measures like the triple glazing and the MVHR and all of that has kind of been part of the process. So thanks for that question, Patrick. Sanya would like to know, Matt, some further information on how the joists were treated to achieve the necessary fire rating.
Yeah, so we looked at a few different options on this, and a bit of project politics even. In the end, it was a monocoat. So it's a steel mesh that's it's like a Latham plaster kind of modern system, and it's like sprayed over the top of it. So it does both the compartmentation from floor to floor as well as the structural integrity at the same time. We did look at boarding options, and there was sort of pros and cons and various options. So this was the route that was preferred by the contractor, and they put it forward. So that's what was sort of developed in the end.
Right. Thanks, Matt. Oh, some questions in about planning process from Janet. So did you receive many comments from it? So how did that flow? Let's just keep it a little bit looser. How did that work?
Islington refused it and we got it at appeal. So it wasn't straightforward. It was quite slow. Again, much of the debate was around that flank elevation. And yeah, the planning inspector sort of gave quite a succinct reply to it. So once we got planning, there was then some amendments we made, so then they've all been quite straightforward. But yeah, the main planning application is quite drawn out.
I mean, I think if anyone attended our most recent past webinar with Carmody Grow, they had to get theirs through appeal as well. I mean, I think it's pretty I wouldn't like to say common, but yeah, it is a process, right? So but thank you, Janet, for that question.
I mean, the main reason maybe just to clarify, the main reason we appealed it was because it had actually been in planning a year, and after a year lapses, you can no longer appeal it, so you lose your right to appeal.
Okay.
And so the decision was made is do we appeal it at this stage, or do we continue negotiations with the council, because we could end up in a sort of no decision ever in that case, whereas we sort of decided let's draw a line under it, get the appeal in, and then if we lose the appeal, we can then resubmit and sort of take on board the comments we made. But yeah, we basically were forced into doing that route because of time limitations on appeals.
So that formality rather than individuals.
Yeah, I mean, we were still speaking with Islington at the time and sort of refining things, but it was just running on the clock really.
Right. Question next about the budget for the project, and how you structured your approach to the budget.
Okay. Yeah, so the client is a family trust, and they own a lot of buildings. They don't really sort of buy and sell and flip buildings. They have a real interest in keeping buildings like this, renovating them and holding on to them as long-term assets. So I think that was really helpful in kind of bringing quality to it. So rather than decisions being made purely on cost grounds, there was often discussions about on long-term running costs as well. So that was really interesting. So even little things like the quality of the paintwork, whether it's a sort of off-the-shelf item that might last 2 years, or you put some kind of little bit more expensive, which means you don't have to put scaffolding up every 5 years. For them, that's a real consideration because the cost of scaffolding is probably more than the cost of the paint. So in this case, spending that little bit more was a really good idea. I think for a developer client who was renovating this building to then sell it, they probably wouldn't make that same decision. So I mean, budget obviously always a consideration, and there was discussions about value engineering and savings, but there was also a lot of discussions about quality and robustness and longevity.
No, it's great, Matt. And sort of similar themed question from Eugenio at Piercy & Co. Asking about the client, which you've answered within the family trust, but a little bit more about that relationship with the client and the detail of that heritage and preservation, and then some of the retrofit measures. Maybe you could just say a bit more, Matt.
Yeah, so so we used to actually be on the top floor of this building when we were there, and the landlord of the building, he was actually on the same floor, so he had the office next to us. So he approached us and said, "Did we want to look at this building?" We have got other projects with them as well, so it's a sort of an established relationship. We've got a new build house we're doing in Islington, up near Highbury with them, and a couple of the projects are sort of in the works. So I think there was quite a bit of trust there, which was good. The project hasn't gone probably as smoothly as it could have done, but we're still working with them on other projects. So I think having a client that sort of values their buildings long term, and you're working with other things as a kind of long term pattern of working that's understood, that makes things smoother even when they're not going fully smooth as they could be.
Yeah, that relationship building over time with the practice is it's important, isn't it? Okay, and then questioning about, you're getting all the like tricky questions here about building control. I mean, you talked about some of the decisions made around sort of compliance with building regs. So this question is, how was any non-compliance with building regulations received from building control? I suppose, like, how was that managed?
Yeah, so I mean the main thing is the fire. So I mean it's not uncommon for a building to be not fully code compliant to have a fire engineered solution. So basically, instead of following the code, I mean the code is really just, this is one way of achieving fire safety. Instead, we had fire engineers look at it, and they make a judgment, and they work out how do you maintain that safety in the building, from human escape to sort of structural stability in a way that's acceptable. So we increase the fire resistance of all the floors. We increase the compartmentation which increases escape times. Travel distances are all quite modest. Again, so a benefit of it being a small building is you have small travel distances in a fire. It's got quite good access being on a main road, so obviously firefighting is helpful. So there's a lot of things there. I mean, there's smoke modelling done. So there's modelling done to say, well, if a fire happens, what happens? How quickly does it spread? How do people escape? So there was a lot of technical kind of resolution in that, and it has smoke extracts. So in the stair core, in the lobbies between the stair core and the offices, there's a smoke extract system that the fire brigade can control that pulls smoke out to roof level.
Right. Thanks, Matt. And final call for questions. We've just got our last 5 minutes of conversation. So if anyone does have any final questions, feel free to just type those in the chat. But Matt, I was curious, you mentioned that you're now off gas with the building and you're predicted to get a high B rating for the EPC, which is fantastic. Yeah. So as a practice, I wondered, like, where do you guys look for that information and that learning to support the clients to deliver these projects? Like, how, what do you do? What's your network?
So I mean, on a project of this scale, we would bring specialists in quite early. So Skelly and Cooch did the initial kind of scoping exercise on the M&E. So sort of sit down with the client and go through lots of questions about, in similar ways to what we would talk about, robustness and longevity. What are they trying to achieve? And then a kind of initial proposals put forward. The project then got put on hold a bit, and then a different engineer picked it up during construction. So Luminous, we were then working with. But I think it's in some ways it's very similar to architects. You just need a very good consultant who, everything down to, the common easy ones are the LED lighting things, but they'll be talking about maintenance cycles of replacing lights, and they'll be asking questions about, are you subcontracting the bill? Are you managing the utilities and then charging those to clients? And do you want a central heating system, or do you want individual heating system? And then people will take on the responsibilities those themselves. So there's a lot of sort of questions that need asking quite early, because it sort of changes whether you end up with like a localized plant room or whether you decentralize it, and how those parts are changed and replaced.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure I answered your question there.
No. I mean, I think you definitely did. It was, I mean, I think that idea of those specialist consultants and doing everything early on to make the right move, so that then as the architects, that sort of flows well is really positive. I suppose I was getting at kind of more commercial buildings are going to have to do better. Their EPC ratings are going to have to, jump from the E's to the C's and the B's. And so I suppose just like that kind of that network of trying to achieve that on scale, Architecture London will be, I suppose, part of that process. I suppose just like where you as a practice look to or fit, or I think it was that sort of thing I was getting at. But I don't know if you want to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we always try and push as much as we can. I think the thing with fabric in particular, we always try and do fabric first. So try and reduce your energy use before you start sticking renewables and things on your building. So, things like the triple glazing on this building, the facade is actually like 50% glass, and consequently making that triple glazing had a huge impact on the EPC. I mean, it was, I don't think I've seen a building that has such a high change on the EPC by changing the glass specification. Because it's probably quite unusual to have quite that high percentage. Whereas changing the roof insulation actually had a lesser impact on it. So it's understanding where you're best to spend your money as well. So again, working with those consultants. But this facade, once these windows have been changed and the walls are being insulated, that's probably not going to change for another 100 years.
Yeah.
And whereas so you're better to spend your money there than you are on fancy toilet fittings or something that's kind of maybe more cosmetic.
Yeah. No, it's great. And I think that's part of us doing these Retrofit 24 learning and sharing sessions, so people kind of see where, the wins are and the successes are in each project. So thanks, Matt. And a final question from an attendee. So from John, thanks, Matt. Can you give the overall cost per square metre? And could you say a bit more about integration of services and structure? So we'll take that as your final question, Matt.
So the cost is quite high. So it's probably about £4,000 a square metre. In some ways, it's probably more expensive than it would have been to knock the building down and start again. Not that you'd get consent to do that, but so it is quite high. I think integration of structure and services. So the structure, we had a lot of early discussions with Nick from Form, like particularly on the core and trying to work out how to, before we do setting out and start playing with patterns and bonds and how to expose it. We had a lot of discussion with Nick on what does and doesn't work, and working out thicknesses of walls, and is there tricks we can do to sort of move that structure around, or reusing bits of the existing structure, because it's not a straightforward section through the building. There's at the front it's all existing, and at the back it's half and half, and it sort of scales as you go through the building. And then the new parts of the building, the new core picks some of the weight off the existing building. So some of the existing steel beams get picked up from the new core, so it deloads structure in some places, and then we add new load on elsewhere. So there's a real complexity to what's going on structurally. So that was quite an early stage. Again, pre-planning, we actually were looking at structural strategy for this. It wasn't sort of let's draw it and then work out how to build it later. Before we even went into planning, we were sort of saying how do we make this stand up and keep the facade and not make it a facade retention project. That was a question we got from planning: is this a facade retention project? So they didn't quite understand that it definitely wasn't. And then services as well. It's, again, I think the services integration is probably much more tightly packed than you would normally probably do on an office building, again because of the footprint and being so small. There was a lot of how do we sort of really squeeze every square meter out of this building, because if you gain an extra square meter across across the 6-7 floors, that's suddenly quite a lot of lettable area you gain back, and then spending a little bit more to achieve that is actually worth doing. So there was a lot of services and nudging things around, and actually the ceiling heights gives you an opportunity to move things higher that you might not normally do. So things like the smoke vent doors we actually put above head height, which means you can make the lobbies smaller, because in a fire the doors open outwards, and normally you need clearance on those. In this case, or they open inwards, and then you have to make your shaft bigger, but you can sort of make the shaft smaller and get the doors above head height, which means you can kind of make everything a bit more compact. So there's kind of games you can play with that vertical space as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you everyone who asked their questions to Matt. So that was great to have your participation in it. So we're going to draw to a close. So obviously I want to thank Matt for speaking today and presenting the project, the Clerkenwell Office. If you have enjoyed the webinar, there'll be some feedback forms coming out through our Eventbrite system. So please do take some time to fill that in. It's super helpful. And if you're a fan of the webinars, we've got another one next Tuesday with Buckley Gray Yeoman and their design team, talking about one of their projects. And we've also got more in-person events, building tours, etc. So do check out the Retrofit 24 program at the Building Centre. Yeah, and recordings. So this event has been recorded and will be shortly shared on our YouTube channel. So if you want to look back, if there's things you missed, or if you want to share it with your colleagues, then yeah, that would be great if you could do that and help spread the word. So yeah, thanks again from the Building Centre, from me, Laura Broderick, and thanks to Matt. So bye everyone. Bye, Matt.
Bye.